Hey, welcome to the Politics of Jesus podcast with Jim Reynolds. Jim is a pastor and a lawyer in Texas, and in this podcast he asks, what are the politics of Jesus? What is the new big life that King Jesus brings to the world, public and private? Join us as we pledge a new allegiance to Jesus, live as his new family, practice justice everywhere, and embody the peace of the Lord until he comes.
Well, concerning cultural issues, something that's hard not to talk about today is homosexuality. And you've actually written two books kind of concerning this topic. The first one was Lepers Among Us. What year was that written in?
2007.
2007, and then maybe 11 years later you write After Obergefell?
Yeah. And
a lot's happened in those 11 years. Yeah. Can you just kind of talk to us about the issue of homosexuality as it concerns the culture and as it concerns the Bible?
Yeah. The book, the 2018 book, was very different to the 2007 book because of enormous culture change that swept through the country. By the time Obergefell decision came down in 2015, 70% of all Americans lived in a jurisdiction where homosexual marriage was legal. So this was a earthquake, a change, cultural change, earthquake proportions in those 11 years. So, and in some cases, the churches were saying, well, we just got to go along with the culture. In some cases, the church was scared and probably more homophobic than ever. The problem that was there before 2007 in the Bible-believing churches was homophobia and the lack of redemption. There's all kinds of gender confusions in the world, and there's a statistic that I thought was really revealing was they did a study of 18-year-olds and their idea of their gender, their gender identity. And by the time these people were, and a bunch of them said they were gay, and the ones that said they were gay, 75% of them by the time they were 25 said they were not gay. So it was a very fluid idea, and it was, maybe they had some kind of an experience growing up that caused them to think they were gay. So we were not having conversations. So if you actually thought you were gay in say 2005, you were 18 years old and you said you were gay in the church, well, you were banished, and you couldn't even have a conversation about it, and nobody talked to you about it, and nobody talked to you about, who you are as a man or affirmed you as a man. If your dad had not been affirming, you would doubt. This would just tend to confirm what you already thought, that I'm not much of. You had all these unconfirmed males, and then the homophobia just was everywhere. I talked to a couple who they were Baptist over in East Texas that came into Dallas to talk to me about this. And they had a son who was living in a gay relationship in New York. This is back before the law changed. And they were afraid. He was a longtime deacon in the Baptist church in East Texas. But he could not even begin to imagine telling anybody in that church about his son. And it was killing he and his wife. They were carrying this load, and they were freaked out, and they're talking to me, and I'm thinking, what a tragedy this is. So I saw this as the biggest issue, so the whole book, Lepers Among Us, was about the church as a redemptive body, and where the heterosexuals get real about all of their stuff, which is every bit as serious, if not way more serious, than the homosexual stuff. And so then the heterosexuals were not talking about any of their stuff. Porn was coming in. They felt they were good with porn. They were good with easy divorces. They were good with their girlfriends, and they would get divorces and remarry and come back into the same church. And so we had a double standard. We had homophobia, and we were not being redemptive. In fact, in some ways, we reminded me more of the Pharisees. So that was where I was coming from in 2007.
And then that changes with the culture, like you talked about, and now the issues become a little bit more different. Homophobia is obviously still an issue. Treating the church as a redemptive body is still something we need a lot of grace and growth in, but it's becoming a little bit more popular to run in line with the culture and say homosexuality isn't a sin, perhaps in part because of the cultural pressure. And a lot of people are using arguments concerning the occasionality of Paul's letters, but you've mentioned that it's really that's actually a valid argument to some degree, but the argument in favor of the biblical standard of man and woman in relationship with another is rooted not so much in Paul's letters, but in Matthew 19, to be precise.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Recently, in the 2018 book, there's huge amount of scholarship about Paul, what he said, the two Greek words he used in 1 Corinthians about homosexuality, and then whether this was transcultural. In other words, whether this was just cultural or could be applicable now as it was then. And people were arguing, well, this is like the slaves be obedient to your masters passage. This is like the shut up passages against women. And we just need to realize that Paul was doing his best in that culture, but this is not applicable to now. Well, I listened to that argument. I think that the argument where we are still trying to argue this based on Paul's letters, but we almost read Paul as if Jesus is Paul's apostle instead of Paul being Jesus' apostle. In other words, Jesus is the king. And in my view, what he did, what he says, carries more weight than anyone in the Bible. In fact, I think it's the center of interpretation of the whole Bible. So when he says to a bunch of guys who are asking him, basically, what does it mean if your wife is unclean what does unfaithful mean? Did it mean, what did it mean? And he says, you're asking the wrong question. You're talking Deuteronomy 9 instead of Genesis 1 and 2. And what he does is cast the vision of one man, one woman in a sacramental covenant for a lifetime. That is the kingdom vision. So what Paul's saying about fornication, about lust for heterosexuals, or about homosexual, everything that's being said about sin is referencing Jesus and what he said. In other words, everything that I sexually might do that doesn't conform with Jesus' vision of a man and a woman in marriage is sin. So yeah, I go back to that passage and I see Jesus casting the vision. He is the Messiah. Paul's his apostle. And he says the same thing as in Mark chapter 10. So that's where I begin with Jesus. So I hold that my view is really, I guess people would call it conservative as to homosexual marriage in the church based on the vision of Jesus. My vision is also conservative when it comes to marriage, divorce, and remarriage, though there's all kinds of situations. But for somebody to walk in a no-fault culture, it's very easy to wink at the, quote, straights and their divorces and get very uptight about the gays and their marriage. It's ironic that straights are not wanting to marry. We have fewer straights, fewer heterosexuals marrying than any other time in American history. And yet the gays have petitioned the Supreme Court to get married. So I don't look at the biggest issue out there is homosexual marriage in the church. I think we got a lot bigger issues than that. But that approach is my approach, to be even-handed about this in the church. If we're not if we're not talking to straights, so to speak, all straights are crooked, by the way. They're all crooked. If we're not talking to them about Jesus' vision as strongly as we are the gay community in the church, then we are again doing double standards, and we're homophobic because for some reason we got this gay thing that it's the sin. So I think also Jesus' compassion for people. If somebody in the church tells me they're gay, then I said, okay, I want to have a long conversation with you. Let's just take off our watches and have a long conversation. I want to talk to you about how you could come to that conclusion. I want to talk to you about your relationship with God, especially. I want to encourage you to pray. I want to tell you that you can disagree with me. I want to tell you that you need to understand the scriptures, what the scriptures say and why they say it. And you need to understand that as we go along with this, you belong. You may say, I'm gay. You belong.
Right.
Well, the lust in any church on the part of heterosexuals is way more serious than the issue of a few people who are struggling with their gender confusion and thinking that they should be relating to their own sex. So that's kind of my way forward now. The church should not be surrendering. The church cannot surrender to the Supreme Court. One of the things I quit talking about, I finished talking about this, is when the Supreme Court ruling came down in 2015, on page 27 of the Obergefell opinion, it said, all of you churches and mosques and synagogues, all you people in your religious faith communities that disagree with us, we want you to know that you're totally free to disagree with us and teach what you understand to be the truth in your communities of faith. And so the week after this decision came down, I talked about that. So what the Supreme Court was saying is that in the United States of America, in this big pluralistic constitutional democracy, it is legal for two people of the same sex to get married. But what my view is, what the Constitution said to us in the church does not change what we in the church say to each other.
And that's fascinating going into this political realm, because I think the church is so guilty of trying to superimpose their values and their beliefs on the political economy of America, when clearly from the text, from the Bible, from the biblical narrative, and from the tradition of church, we can observe that anytime there's a direct association between church and state, it's not healthy for Christianity. It's not healthy for culture. And yet, in America especially, I think we're so guilty of again, just imposing our beliefs on politics and seeing politics as the primary realm of the progression and of the church and the mission of the gospel, whenever that's really just another one of those things that is veering us off from the primary issue, which is unity, and also is steering us even further away from suffering, which is such a rich theme in the New Testament.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's really good. Yes. When the church is disestablished, as it is in America, then the founding fathers intended that that the state would get out of the God business, and they would not be able to ram. I think the fundamental issue was whether or not the Catholics would get control, or the Calvinists, or anybody, and then ram down that theology, ram that down everybody's throat and kill everybody that didn't agree. Because that had been what had happened in Europe, and they had never worked out church state, even all the way back. And even when the Protestant Reformation came down, the wars began, because the Catholics and the Protestants would fight over who was going to be in charge of Germany or who was going to be in charge of France. So it's from 1618 to 1648, 40% of all Europeans died over over theology. Well, we got away from that, but still hanging around in the church today is sort of a theocratic notion that this is a Christian country and we are supposed to be bringing the values and teachings of the Supreme Court into the government. Well, that's not constitutional. You can't do that. That would be a violation of church and state. But what's dangerous about it is there are preachers that are ignorant that quote the early Puritans, because the earliest founders, the folks that landed in the early 17th century were Puritans, and they had no idea of tolerance. So you can quote Witherspoon or some of those other early Puritan preachers, and they did not believe in tolerance. They said just the opposite. So you can argue, listening to those guys, that this country is a theocracy, and that the problem right now is that a certain Christian theology is not in charge, and we've got to make Christianity, we've got to make America Christian again, is really what we're talking about here.
Right.
So what happens is, what we're really doing is trying to get the government to help us disciple people. The fact is, that's no longer constitutional. That cannot work. It's like you said, it's utterly corrupting. One thing that's interesting about this is Paul and Jesus, both of them are calling communities of faith to live the Christian way of life, the disciples' way of life. Neither one of them give a rip about what the law is. In other words, Paul knows that in the Roman Empire, a lot of guys had mistresses, they had concubines, and they had wives. Well, he's not going to allow that. And they also went to the temple to the prostitutes. He cuts all of that out and says, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. He doesn't care what the Roman law is. He's calling people to the vision of the kingdom that comes out of Matthew 19. And so he's calling the church to be the church, and not the church should not get any help from the government to do the work of discipling. Any expectation otherwise is corrupting. So what you said, and so what happens is, what actually I think we want is what you alluded to. We'd like to have an easy discipleship with no suffering, because we got government will come in and save us from any kind of suffering.
And it is somewhat ironic, just to, like I mentioned earlier, to look at the history of the church and to see the times when the church was most vibrant. And you can actually look around today at the church, and you look at the church in China, and you look at the church in the Middle East, the underground church that's growing, and is the reports that we hear from over there it's unreal, the kind of richness and they're living in spite of social, cultural, physical persecution. And yet we so misguidedly long for prosperity in America. And it's hard not to, because that's what we've been raised in, and that's what we've been raised hearing.
Yep.
But yet the message of tradition, the message of Scripture is the church is healthiest, Christianity is most powerful when we're undergoing persecution rather than prosperity.
Yeah, that is really good. And I'm sitting here thinking about what you just said, that what happens to us is what we're doing right now in America is what some scholars call it's a consumer cult, or the cult. And so in churches, a cult is a place where somebody besides Jesus or Scripture has infallible authority. And we think of different cults we've known about in the past, Jim Jones or David Koresh or whatever. But now the person that has absolute authority in the church is the consumer. The person that comes in and says, okay, I want you to meet my needs or meet our family's needs, or I'm out of here. And they're calling the shots. So what happens is, along with what you just said, is if you're looking for cultural approval, power, governmental power, you play to the consumer.
Right.
And the consumer may not even believe much. Just want you to help them out. They got problems with their kids. They want you to help them, but they sure don't want you to preach the discipleship. So that is a very different culture, church culture, than what you would have in China that you just referred to, where it's underground. They're not about to let the government know where they are because they're going to get controlled, and they're not about to come up for air above the culture because they're going to be controlled. So those you bet those house churches over there are preaching and teaching a different message than what American megachurches often are preaching.
Right.